I'd always thought my life with Clara was a steady thing, like the oak tree in our backyard, rooted deep, unshaken by storms. 20 years of marriage, 2 kids grown and off to college, and a quiet house in the suburbs that hummed with routine. I'm James, a structural engineer by trade, the kind of guy who likes blueprints and certainties. Clara was the artist, a painter whose canvases filled our walls with wild colors I never quite understood but loved anyway. She'd laugh and call me her anchor, the one who kept her tethered when her imagination ran too far. That's how it was, or so I thought, until the drift started. It wasn't obvious at first. She'd always been a night owl, staying up late in her studio, a converted shed out back. I'd wake up to an empty bed, stumble out with coffee, and find her lost in brushstrokes. But last spring something shifted. The late nights stretched longer, and she started locking the studio door. "I need focus, James," she'd say, her hazel eyes dodging mine. I'd nod, trusting her, because that's what you do after 2 decades. Trust. Then came the trips. She joined an art collective downtown, a group of creators who met weekly to critique and inspire. At first, it was Tuesdays, then Fridays too. Soon, she'd vanish for entire weekends, retreats, she called them. "It's about growth," she'd explain, tossing her auburn hair over her shoulder. I'd smile, proud of her passion, even if I missed her warmth beside me. But the house grew quieter, and her returns felt less like homecomings. She'd breeze in, distracted, her phone buzzing more than it ever had. I'd ask about the retreats, and she'd give me scraps, vague mentions of galleries, wine, laughter. I'd nod again, filing it away, telling myself it was nothing. One night I couldn't sleep. The clock blinked 2:17 a.m., and her side of the bed was still cold. I wandered out back, the moon casting long shadows across the lawn. The studio light glowed through the curtains, and I heard her voice, soft, lilting, not the tone she used with me. I pressed my ear to the door, heart thudding, and caught fragments. "You're right. Tomorrow then. I can't wait." My stomach twisted. I knocked, and the light snapped off. She opened the door, paint-smeared and smiling too wide. "James, you startled me. Just finishing up." I asked who she was talking to. "Myself," she said, laughing. "You know how I get." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. But the seed was planted. Weeks passed, and that seed grew thorns. Clara's absences piled up, each one leaving a sharper edge on my nerves. I started noticing things, her perfume lingering stronger some mornings, her wardrobe shifting to bolder cuts, the way she'd tuck her phone away when I entered the room. I wasn't a suspicious man by nature, but doubt is a quiet architect, building walls where trust once stood. I told myself I was overreacting. People change. Marriages evolve. But then I met Ethan. It was at an art show, one of those collective events Clara insisted I attend. "Support me, James," she'd said, her voice bright but brittle. I went, dressed in my best jacket, feeling like a blueprint among abstract sketches. The gallery buzzed with pretentious chatter, wine glasses clinking, and Clara flitted about, radiant in a crimson dress I'd never seen. She introduced me to her friends. Vague names, fleeting handshakes, until Ethan stepped forward. Tall, lean, with a sculptor's hands and a smile that lingered too long. "James, right? Clara's told me so much," he said, his voice smooth as river stone. I shook his hand, noting the grip, the way his eyes flicked to her. They talked too close, too easy. He'd lean in, whispering critiques about a canvas, and she'd laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. I stood there, holding my untouched wine, watching the room shrink around them. People drifted by, but I saw only their orbit. His hand brushing her arm, her head tilting toward him. I asked her later, casual as I could manage, who Ethan was. "Just a friend," she said, peeling an orange at the kitchen counter, not meeting my eyes. "He's talented. Inspiring." I nodded, but the thorns tightened. That night I couldn't sleep again. I found her phone charging on the dresser. Unlocked, a rarity. My hands shook as I scrolled. Texts from E. Short, cryptic. "Missed you today. Can't stop thinking about last night. You're my muse. My chest burned. I put the phone down, staring at her sleeping form, her breath steady while mine unraveled. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, something solid to hold against the chaos in my head. Proof came unbidden, a cruel gift wrapped in carelessness. It was a Thursday, gray and damp, when Clara left for another retreat. She'd kissed my cheek, rushed out with a duffel bag, and I'd watched her car disappear down the street. But an hour later, her scarf, bright green, her favorite, lay forgotten on the hall table. I grabbed it, thinking I'd drop it off at the gallery where she said they'd meet. I drove, rehearsing a quick hello, imagining her smile. The gallery was empty, lights off, a sign reading, closed for renovation. My pulse quickened. I called her, no answer. I drove to the collective studio space downtown, a loft she'd described in passing. The building loomed, industrial and stark, and I parked across the street, scarf in hand. That's when I saw them, Clara and Ethan, stepping out together, her arm looped through his. She laughed, head thrown back, and he pulled her close, their lips meeting in a way that wasn't friendly or fleeting. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, the scarf slipping to the floor. I followed them. I don't know why, instinct maybe, or the need to see how deep the lie ran. They drove to a hotel, a sleek place on the edge of town. I parked far enough to stay unseen, watching as they checked in, her hand on his back, his on her waist. They vanished inside, and I sat there, rain streaking the windshield, piecing it together. The retreats, the late nights, the locked studio, it wasn't art. It was him. Hours passed before I drove home, the scarf still on the passenger seat, a mocking relic of what I'd lost. I didn't confront her when she returned. She breezed in Sunday night, humming, her hair mussed and her cheeks flushed. Great weekend, she said, dropping her bag. I nodded, pouring coffee, my hands steady despite the tempest inside. I'd spent those days alone, replaying every moment, every lie. The texts, the kiss, the hotel, they burned behind my eyes, but I kept them buried. I needed a plan, something colder than anger, something she'd never see coming. I started small, gathering evidence. I borrowed a friend's camera, a discreet thing with a good zoom, and tracked her next retreat. Same hotel, same routine, Ethan's car, their laughter, the way they moved like they'd done it 100 times. I snapped photos, timestamps glowing in the corners. I hacked her phone's cloud backup. Years of engineering taught me precision, and found more. Messages, photos, plans. They weren't careful. They didn't think I'd look. Clara noticed nothing. She'd paint, smile, ask about my day, oblivious to the storm brewing. I played along, perfecting the mask. Dinners together, small talk, even a kiss goodnight. But every touch felt like ash. Every word a rehearsal for what was coming. I wasn't just hurt. I was unmade. She'd taken our life, our trust, and handed it to him. And for what? Inspiration. I'd show her inspiration. Revenge began quietly, a slow unraveling she wouldn't feel until it was too late. I knew Clara, her pride, her need for admiration. Ethan was her mirror, reflecting the artist she wanted to be. I'd shatter that reflection. Step 1. Discredit him. He was a sculptor, mid-tier, with a small following. I dug into his past, public records, old posts, anything. Turns out, Ethan had a history. A plagiarism scandal years back, hushed up but not erased. I anonymously tipped off a local art blog, planting seeds. Is Ethan Reed at it again? The post read, with just enough detail to stir whispers. Next, I hit her where it hurt, her work. Clara thrived on validation, gallery shows, critiques, applause. I'd been her biggest fan, but now I'd be her shadow. She had a piece due for a juried exhibition, a big one. I'd seen it in the studio, a swirling abstract she'd poured months into. One night, while she slept, I slipped out back, unlocked the door with a spare key, and spilled turpentine across the canvas. Not enough to ruin it outright, just enough to blur the edges, dull the colors. She'd wake up, see the accident, and doubt herself. It was petty, yes, but it was only the beginning. She cried the next morning, staring at the mess. "How did this happen?" she asked, voice breaking. I hugged her, murmuring sympathy, hiding the cold satisfaction in my chest. The exhibition deadline passed, her piece unready. Ethan couldn't fix that. The whispers about him grew louder too. Clara mentioned them over dinner, frowning. "People are so cruel," she said. I nodded, sipping my wine, thinking, you have no idea. Clara's world began to fray, thread by thread, and I was the weaver pulling the strings. The turpentine accident left her shaken, her confidence chipped. She'd stare at her ruined canvas, muttering about bad luck, while I brewed coffee and offered hollow comfort. Ethan tried to lift her spirits. I saw the texts, his promises to make it right, but I'd already planted the next seed. The art blog's whispers about his past grew into a murmur, and I fanned the flames. I created a burner account, posted old court documents I dug up, Ethan's plagiarism case, complete with a blurry photo of him leaving the courthouse. "Once a thief, always a thief," I typed, hitting send. The collective felt it first. Clara came home one night, eyes red, saying there'd been a meeting, tense, awkward. "Someone's spreading lies about Ethan," she said, peeling potatoes with quick, angry strokes. "It's ridiculous." I nodded, chopping onions, hiding the smirk behind a grimace. "People can be vicious," I said, and she sighed, agreeing. She didn't suspect me. Why would she? I was James, steady James, the man who fixed leaky faucets and paid the bills. Not the one unraveling her lover's life. I didn't stop there. Ethan's next show was in 2 weeks. A solo gig at a small gallery, his chance to shine. I called the owner, posing as a concerned patron, dropping hints about ethical concerns and reputation risks. I emailed a few critics too, anonymous tips with just enough truth to stir doubt. The gallery didn't cancel, but the buzz soured. Clara fretted over it, pacing the kitchen, her phone buzzing with his complaints. "He's losing sponsors," she said, voice tight. I poured her wine, murmuring sympathy, thinking, good. Clara's loyalty to Ethan fascinated me. How she clung to him even as his shine dulled. It wasn't love, I decided. It was need. He fed her something I couldn't, something wild and reckless. So I turned the blade inward, targeting her reflection in him. She'd always been vain about her art, her identity tied to every stroke. I'd praised her for years, but now I'd used that pride against her. I started with her supplies. She ordered custom paints from a boutique supplier. Expensive, rare hues she swore by. I intercepted a shipment, swapped the tubes for cheap knockoffs I'd mixed with subtle flaws. Colors that muddied when blended, oils that dried too fast. She didn't notice at first, brushing them onto a new canvas, but the frustration crept in. "Something's off," she'd mutter, scraping at the layers. I'd peer over her shoulder, suggesting maybe her inspiration was fading. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Then I struck deeper. She'd submitted sketches to a local mural project, public art, a big deal. I'd seen the designs. Bold, chaotic, pure Clara. I hacked her email child's play for an engineer with time and sent a withdrawal. "Personal reasons," I wrote, mimicking her tone. The committee moved on, picking someone else. When she found out, she stormed into the house, furious. "They didn't even tell me," she snapped, slamming her bag down. I shrugged, flipping through a magazine. "Maybe they didn't like your style anymore." The barb landed. Her eyes flashed, wounded. Ethan's show arrived, and it was a disaster. The gallery was half empty, critics lukewarm, whispers of his past trailing him like smoke. Clara went, of course, dressed in that crimson dress, determined to prop him up. I stayed home, sipping bourbon, imagining her face as the night crumbled. She returned late, silent, her heels clicking past me to the bedroom. "How'd it go?" I called. "Fine," she said, voice flat. I didn't press. I didn't need to. The photos I'd hired a kid to take, discreet shots of Ethan arguing with a sponsor, Clara standing alone, told me enough. Their connection started to buckle. Her phone buzzed less. His name popped up with shorter replies. I'd catch her staring out the window, lost, her fingers tapping restless rhythms. You okay? I'd ask, all concern. She'd nod, forcing a smile, but the cracks showed. I fed them, subtly, mentioning a colleague's happy marriage, leaving art magazines open to glowing reviews of others. You used to get notices like that, I'd say, casual. She'd flinch, retreating to her studio, locking the door. I upped the ante. Ethan had a studio downtown, a rented space he shared with 2 others. I called the landlord, posing as a city inspector, claiming code violations, faulty wiring, bad plumbing. A real inspection followed, and the place got shut down for repairs. Ethan scrambled, texting Clara about the nightmare. She tried to help, offering our shed, but I shut that down. We need the space, I said, firm. She glared, but I held my ground, watching her squirm. Clara changed. The fire that once lit her dimmed, replaced by a jittery edge. She'd paint less, stare more, her hands trembling over half-finished works. Ethan's troubles piled up, lost gigs, a canceled commission, and she absorbed it, a sponge for his chaos. I watched, silent, as she shrank into herself. The woman who'd laughed with him at the hotel was gone, leaving a hollow shell pacing our house. I pushed harder. She'd always loved her garden. Roses, lavender, a sanctuary. I hired a landscaper, claiming it needed updating, and had them rip it out, new sod, sterile shrubs. She came home to a barren yard, gasping. What happened? She cried, kneeling in the dirt. Thought you'd like a fresh start, I said, shrugging. She didn't fight, just sat there, tears streaking her face. I walked away, satisfied. Her art suffered too. The knockoff paints ruined everything. Smudged lines, dull tones. She blamed herself, her talent, not the tools. I'd hear her in the studio, cursing under her breath, canvases piling up unfinished. Maybe take a break, I suggested one night, pouring tea. She snapped, you don't get it, and stormed off. I sipped my drink, calm, knowing she was breaking. The end came quietly, a fracture too deep to mend. Ethan called one night. I saw his name flash on her screen. She answered, stepping outside, her voice low. I cracked the window, listening. I can't keep doing this, he said, tired. It's too much. She begged, soft, desperate, but he hung up. She stood there, phone limp, then came inside, pale. You okay? I asked, flipping channels. She nodded, mute, and went upstairs. I struck the killing blow. She'd entered a small show, a last-ditch effort to reclaim herself. I'd seen the piece, a fragile, hopeful thing. The night before, I slipped into the gallery, unlocked, careless, and swapped her nameplate with another's. Her work hung, but the credit went elsewhere. She arrived, saw it, and left without a word. When she got home, she sat at the table, staring at nothing. They didn't even know it was mine, she whispered. I nodded, slicing an apple. Guess they didn't. Her affair was ash now, Ethan gone, her art disgraced. She didn't suspect me, not yet, but I wasn't done. The cruelest cut waited, patient and sharp. Clara's collapse was a slow, silent thing, like a house settling into ruin. She stopped painting altogether, her studio gathering dust, brushes stiffening in jars. She'd wander the house, hollow-eyed, her auburn hair tangled, her voice a whisper when she spoke at all. I watched, pretending concern, asking if she needed anything. Tea, a walk, a friend. I'm fine, she'd say, but she wasn't. Ethan's absence left a void, and I'd filled it with shadows. I decided it was time to peel back the mask, just enough to twist the knife. One evening, over dinner, burnt chicken she'd barely touched. I slid a photo across the table. It was one I'd taken. Her and Ethan outside the hotel, his arm around her, her smile wide. Her fork clattered to the plate. Where'd you get this? She asked, voice trembling. Does it matter? I said, leaning back. I've known for months, Clara. Every retreat, every late night. Him. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stop. You thought I wouldn't notice? She stammered, excuses tumbling out. How it just happened. How she needed something more. I let her talk, her words piling up like debris, then cut her off. I trusted you, I said cold. 20 years and you gave it to him. She cried then, head in her hands, but I felt nothing. No rage, no pity. Just the calm of a plan nearing its end. I left her there, sobbing, and went to bed, the photo still on the table like a gravestone. Clara thought my silence meant forgiveness, a chance to rebuild. She was wrong. I'd spent weeks preparing the next strike, something public, permanent. She'd clung to her reputation, her art, her name, even as it crumbled. I take that too. The collective was hosting an anniversary gala, a big event with donors, critics, the whole scene. Clara planned to attend, hoping to salvage her standing. I let her think she could. I'd gathered everything. The photos, the texts, Ethan's plagiarism files, even receipts from the hotel, proof of their entanglement. I didn't just want her to hurt. I wanted her exposed. I mocked up a sleek pamphlet, The Muse and the Fraud, detailing their affair and his shady past with timestamps and images. It was clinical, precise, like a blueprint of betrayal. I hired a courier to slip copies into the gala gift bags, hundreds of them, discreetly tucked among the programs. The night arrived, and Clara went, dressed in black, a fragile attempt at dignity. I stayed home, imagining the moment. Guests flipping through bags, gasps rippling through the crowd, her name whispered in disgust. She came back hours later, ashen, clutching her purse. They all knew, she said, voice breaking. Someone told them everything. I nodded, flipping through a book. Guess secrets don't stay buried. She stared at me, suspicion flickering, but I met her gaze, blank as stone. Ethan wasn't spared. His career was already teetering. My whispers, the studio closure, but the gala finished him. The pamphlet named him too, and the art world doesn't forgive thieves twice. Galleries dropped him, collectors pulled funding, and his name turned toxic. I tracked it online, watching posts pile up, Ethan Reed exposed, Clara's downfall tied to fraud. He called her once. I heard her take it in the hall, her voice pleading. We can fix this, she said, but he cut her off. It's over, he snapped and hung up. I wasn't done with him. He'd moved to a cheap apartment downtown, licking his wounds. I found it, public records are a treasure trove, and paid a visit. Not directly, of course. I hired a crew, rough types who'd do anything for cash, and had them trash the place. They smashed his sculptures, poured paint over what was left him with nothing but rubble. He'd wake up to chaos. No clue who'd done it, but I'd know. Clara heard about it days later, a friend texting her the news. She sat on the couch, staring at her phone, muttering, "Who would do this?" I shrugged, sipping coffee. Karma, maybe? Clara was a ghost now, haunting our house. The gala broke her spirit. Ethan's ruin took her hope. She stopped leaving, stopped eating much, just sat by the window, watching the world she'd lost. I kept up the act, cooking, cleaning, asking how she was while tightening the noose. I canceled her phone plan, claiming budget cuts. Cut off her internet, said the router broke. She had no one left to call anyway. I sold her studio supplies next. Brushes, paints, easels. Listing them online as barely used. She didn't notice until a buyer came by, hauling it away. "What's this?" she asked, dazed, standing in the empty shed. "We don't need it anymore," I said, stacking boxes. She didn't fight, just shuffled back inside, defeated. I donated her old canvases to a thrift store, every trace of her art erased. The house felt lighter, cleaner, mine again. One night she tried to talk. "James," she whispered, "can we fix this?" I looked at her, thin, faded, a stranger, and shook my head. "You fixed it already," I said, walking away. She didn't follow. The next morning, I found her note. "I'm sorry. I'm leaving." Her car was gone, a few clothes missing. I didn't chase her. She'd go to her sister's, maybe, or drift somewhere else. It didn't matter. She was nothing now. I won. Clara was gone. Ethan destroyed. Their affair a wreckage I'd orchestrated note by note. The house was quiet, mine alone, and I savored it. Every empty room, every silent corner. I'd rebuilt my life, not with trust or love, but with control. Friends asked where she'd gone. I'd shrug, say she needed space, let them assume what they wanted. No one suspected me. Why would they? I was James, steady James, the man who'd endured. Ethan surfaced once, months later, working some dead-end job, janitor, I heard. I drove by once, saw him sweeping, head down, a shell of the man who'd taken her from me. I smiled, slow and cold, and kept driving. Clara sent a letter eventually, a rambling apology, begging to come back. I burned it, watched the ashes scatter in the yard where her garden once grew. Revenge wasn't loud or messy. It was patient, precise, a structure I'd engineered to last. I'd lost her long before she left, but I'd taken everything she'd valued. Her art, her lover, her pride, and left her with less than nothing. I poured a drink that night, sat in the dark, and felt the weight lift. The oak tree outside stood tall, unshaken, just like me. The storm was over, and I was still here.